Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're really diving deep today into the ideas of Carl von Clausewitz.
Oh, absolutely.
His book on war,
Yeah.
specifically Chapter 25 of Book 6,
Okay.
Retreat into the Interior of the Country.
Yeah.
So we know that you, as a member of the military, are probably already familiar with Clausewitz.
Sure.
But this chapter really stuck out to us as something worth revisiting. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's always fascinating to see how a work written in the early 19th century can still be so relevant in a modern military context.
Right. It's amazing. And for anyone who needs a refresher, what Clausewitz is arguing here
Yeah.
is that retreating deeper into your own territory can actually be a strategic advantage,
Yeah.
not just a last-ditch effort.
Right.
So it sounds counterintuitive,
It does.
but he kind of lays out a really compelling case.
He does.
So what is the main idea here?
Well, the main idea that Clausewitz is getting at is that a well-executed retreat, it leverages terrain and logistics, and it essentially turns an enemy's advance into their weakness. So as an attacking force pushes forward, they inherently stretch their supply lines, right?
Right.
And that makes them vulnerable.
Okay, so you're intentionally making the enemy overextend themselves.
Yeah.
But why retreat at all? Wouldn't it be more effective to just hold a defensive line?
Well, that's where I think Clausewitz's strategic genius comes in,
Yeah.
you know? Because by retreating, but retreating in a controlled manner, offering resistance along the way, you further exacerbate the enemy's logistical challenges
Oh, okay.
while boosting your own morale because you're fighting on your own turf.
So you're sapping their resources and their will to fight all at the same time.
You got it.
Can you give me an example of how this might play out?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Clausewitz himself points to Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812.
Yeah.
Napoleon's army, initially successful, they marched deep into Russia. But the Russians, they employed what's called a scorched earth policy as they retreated, leaving nothing for Napoleon's forces to sustain themselves with. This, coupled with the harsh Russian winter
Yeah, of course.
and the constant harassment,
Yeah.
decimated the French army.
Right. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow is practically synonymous with military disaster.
Absolutely.
And it really just highlights how important logistics and supply lines are for any campaign.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And while the sheer size and climate of Russia definitely played a part,
Right.
the principles that Clausewitz is outlining, they have broader applications, even in modern warfare.
Okay.
I mean, think about the challenges faced by modern armies in prolonged engagements in hostile territories.
Right.
Places like Afghanistan, for instance. The terrain, the distances, the difficulty of maintaining those supply lines, all of that plays a role.
It's about understanding how to use the environment to your advantage.
Yes.
Turning it into a weapon against your adversary.
Precisely. And that's not all. Clausewitz goes on to identify several other critical factors for a successful retreat into the interior.
Okay, like what? Give me the rundown.
Well, for one, the support of the local population is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
Having access to intelligence, logistical support, even direct resistance from the local populace can really tip the scales. It's about turning the battlefield into a multifaceted challenge for your adversary.
It's like fighting a hydra. You cut off one head and two more grow back.
Exactly. And then you've got the economic dimension. So the defending force, they can leverage local resources while denying them to the enemy.
Okay.
Think scorched earth tactics again.
Right.
But it could also be as simple as denying access to local infrastructure or disrupting supply chains.
So it's a war on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
Not just on the battlefield, but also economically and logistically.
Precisely.
Oh,
However,
okay.
Clausewitz acknowledges that retreating, even strategically, can have a significant psychological impact
Of course.
on your forces and your population.
Well, yeah, because retreating, I mean, even if it's all part of a larger plan,
Right.
can be perceived as a sign of weakness.
Absolutely. And that's where clear communication and strong leadership are absolutely paramount. The leadership needs to effectively communicate the rationale behind the retreat to maintain morale and national unity. You're asking your people to trust in a plan that seems, I mean, it might seem counterintuitive at first, right?
Right.
To accept, some short-term losses for long-term gains.
It sounds like leadership plays a really, really crucial role in this strategy.
Mhm.
Not just in, commanding troops, but also in rallying the public, getting them on board with the plan.
Absolutely. Yeah. Clausewitz really stresses that warfare is inherently kind of intertwined with social and political factors. You can't separate the battlefield from the home front. But let's get back to the tactical side of things, so to speak.
Okay.
Clausewitz argues that a commander should really aim to transition from this, strategic retreat to a more offensive posture when the enemy has been sufficiently weakened.
That makes sense. But how do you determine, how do you know when that moment arrives? When it's time to sort of shift gears?
Yeah, well, it is a judgment call informed by, a deep understanding of your enemy's capabilities and morale. When you start to see their offensive momentum falter, when their supply lines are strained to the breaking point, their troops are demoralized.
Yeah.
That's when you start probing for weaknesses, launching localized counterattacks, and, gradually you start to seize the initiative.
So you're not necessarily looking for like a single decisive battle to end it all. It's more like a series of engagements that are designed to just chip away at their strength and resolve over time.
Precisely. Yeah, think of it like, a boxer wearing down their opponent, with body blows
Okay.
before going for that knockout punch. Every successful counterattack, every disruption of their supply lines, every raid on their flanks, all of these contribute to shifting that balance of power in your favor.
It's fascinating how Clausewitz really kind of turns the traditional view of defense on its head. You're not just holding ground. You're actively shaping the battlefield, manipulating your enemy's movements, dictating the tempo of the conflict, even while retreating.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really crucial point, which is Clausewitz's, how he was a little skeptical
Oh, okay.
of what he calls a divergent retreat.
Divergent retreat. What's that?
So it's essentially when an army, instead of retreating as a cohesive unit, splits into multiple groups,
Okay.
retreating along different paths.
I can see how that might seem appealing. Multiple lines of retreat. It's harder for the enemy to pin you down.
Yeah.
But Clausewitz wasn't a fan of this.
He wasn't a huge fan. He saw it as a very risky proposition, especially when you're facing a larger, more coordinated enemy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When you divide your forces, it gives the attacker the advantage of what's called interior lines.
Interior lines. What is that?
So imagine your forces are scattered. Right. While the enemy, they're positioned kind of between your separated units. They can move much more quickly and efficiently to engage each group individually. So they can concentrate their forces, strike at your weaker points while you're still trying to regroup,
That makes sense. Sticking together allows you to present a much more formidable defense and react to threats more effectively.
Exactly. However, even while advocating for a concentrated retreat, Clausewitz does acknowledge the potential of a sudden change of direction as a way to kind of disrupt the enemy's plans.
A change of direction, you mean like instead of retreating further back, you suddenly shift your line of retreat?
Exactly, yeah, and he uses the example of the Russian army's sudden shift towards Kaluga during the 1812 campaign against Napoleon.
Yeah.
So, this unexpected maneuver, it completely threw the French logistical system, already strained to its limits,
Of course.
into complete disarray.
Talk about a curveball.
Yeah.
But why was this particular maneuver so effective?
Well, remember how we talked about the French army's overextended supply lines?
Right, yeah.
This sudden change of direction by the Russians forced the French to completely reorient their logistics,
Well,
costing them valuable time and resources.
it's like yanking the rug out from under them just as they thought they had the upper hand.
Exactly.
Wow. So it's not just about retreating, it's about using that retreat to create opportunities for disruption and maneuver. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the strategy.
It does, yeah, and it highlights another critical point that Clausewitz makes. Successful warfare isn't about, rigid adherence to any single plan.
Right.
It's about adaptation. It's about seizing opportunities as they arise. It's about constantly thinking a few steps ahead of your adversary.
It's like playing chess on a grand scale, constantly anticipating your opponent's moves and adjusting your strategy accordingly.
That's a great analogy. But instead of a chessboard, you're dealing with, real lives, vast distances, unpredictable weather, and then, just the constantly shifting political landscapes.
Absolutely. It makes you appreciate the immense pressure and responsibility that commanders face in these situations.
Oh, yeah.
So much of what we've discussed really hinges on making the right call at the right time.
Absolutely. And that's why Clausewitz stresses the importance of sound judgment, experience, and a deep understanding of this, the art of war.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about, weighing the risks and rewards of every decision, understanding the potential consequences of each move. And that's where Clausewitz's analysis of strategic retreat becomes so valuable, because he provides a framework,
Right.
for thinking through these really complex scenarios, for assessing not just, the tactical situation on the ground,
Right.
but also the broader strategic and political implications of every action.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz's retreat into the interior of the country, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most crucial point here is that a strategic retreat, it's not about simply falling back or conceding defeat.
Yeah.
It's a calculated maneuver.
Right.
It's a way to leverage, your understanding of the terrain, the logistics, the morale,
Right.
to gain an advantage over your opponent.
It's about turning the tables,
Yeah.
using the enemy's momentum against them.
Exactly.
And we've seen this play out, time and again throughout history, from, the ancient world to modern conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. And, think about, the Fabian strategy
Yes.
employed by the Roman general Fabius Maximus against Hannibal during the Second Punic War.
Yeah.
So instead of meeting Hannibal's forces head on,
Right.
Fabius engaged in this war of attrition, right?
Right.
Harassing Hannibal's supply lines, forcing him to exhaust his resources.
And this strategy ultimately contributed to Rome's victory.
Yes.
Even though it meant, enduring those initial setbacks and ceding territory.
It did. But you know what Clausewitz reminds us is that sometimes the path to victory requires unconventional thinking,
Right.
adaptability, a willingness to challenge those traditional notions of warfare. It's about recognizing that there's no, one-size-fits-all approach to strategy,
Right.
and that sometimes a strategic retreat can be the most effective way to achieve your objective.
It's a really powerful reminder that true mastery of warfare, it lies not just in knowing when to fight,
Right.
but also when to exercise strategic patience, to cede ground in order to gain the upper hand.
Absolutely. And as you continue your service, just remember this deep dive into Clausewitz. He's really providing you with the historical and theoretical tools to analyze strategies.
Right.
Predict your adversary's moves and make those really informed decisions on the battlefield, no matter the situation.
Always be thinking a few steps ahead, weighing those risks and rewards,
Mhm.
and never underestimate the power of a well-executed strategic retreat.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Carl von Clausewitz's retreat into the interior of the country. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.